And so now we have birth and the public ministry, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the Jesus event, the thing that happened that is the basis for everything the church has been and everything the church has done since then. So then what happened? Well, there's a period of time from 36 to 39 until 70 where several distinctive versions of the Christian movement began to develop. In and around Jerusalem, there developed a following of Jesus that was deeply rooted in the Jewishness of Jesus and in his role as the Jewish Messiah. We're told in Acts that early on, every day, Jesus' disciples, led by the apostles, were in the temple day by day by day, keeping all of the rites and rituals of Jewish prayer and Jewish worship while teaching about Jesus as Messiah. Now, when we think temple, we might think of our own church services, and our own church services are very focused. So you come, and there's one thing going on, and you pay attention to that one thing. At least in its courtyards, the temple was a very different thing altogether. All of the people of Judea that gathered in and around the temple every day, and especially for the high holy days, came not only for the worship experience, but to hear the arguments and debates that happened between different leaders who led different versions of the Jewish experience, the Jewish faith. And so the followers of Jesus became another one of those groups, along with Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and Herodians and all the others that we don't know very much about, that would have gathered in the temple every day to contend with one another and to teach and put forth their idea of what it was it meant to be a faithful Jew. It may be that the book of James and it may be that the book of Hebrews represent that kind of Christian experience, because both of those books focus very much on the ethics of living our lives now able to fully live out the law because of what Jesus the Christ has done for us. Both of those books focus very much on the ethics of Jesus, in James's case, and on the crucifixion of Jesus as the perfect and final sacrifice, as in the book of Hebrews. Neither of those books mention the resurrection. And that doesn't have to mean anything except that they don't mention the resurrection. What they focus on is the effect of Jesus' sacrifice as the final sacrifice, so that temple sacrifices no longer had meaning. Jesus' sacrifice was the final all-sufficient sacrifice. And now because of that, we're able to live in this world fully living out the demands of the law. And so one can imagine that James, Peter, and John, and the others who were a part of the Jerusalem group would have been in the temple every day contending with Pharisees and Sadducees and members of the Sanhedrin and others for that very idea. That group I'm going to signify by this line, and this line will be that group continuing forward. And they stop at about 70 A.D., when Jerusalem is sacked by the Romans and the temple is destroyed. That's a momentous event in Judaism. There's another group of followers of Jesus, and those are the people who saw him and heard him as he wandered among the villages of the Galilee in the north and taught them and worked his miracles among them. These followers were not educated people, perhaps. They would have been what were called the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. They would have been farmers, they would have been fisher folk, and in fact that's why so many of Jesus' stories are about farmers and fisher folk and common people, because that's who was up there. If you can imagine Jerusalem as the major urban hub of Jewish life, then the Galilee region was more rural and more smaller scale. Now, near Jesus' hometown of Nazareth, there was a major Roman development, a Roman city called Sepphoris, but Jesus seems to have spent his ministry and his life amongst the folks of places like Capernaum and Bethsaida, where people lived simple lives, where they fished, where they grew their own food, and that his stories reflect that. It seems that those folks remembered those things Jesus said and did among them as he walked among them and taught among them in the Galilee. And we think that they may even have preserved those sayings and those events in a document that we call Q. And Q comes from a German word that means source. And so this was a source book. And as we'll see here in a moment, that source of sayings and teachings and actions, miraculous actions, that source book was used by Luke and by Matthew as they told their story of Jesus. They used those sayings and wove them into their story. We don't have a copy of Q in our hands right now. What we have are those passages in Matthew and in Luke that are almost word for word the same in the original biblical languages. Now, that would be impossible if two people were writing separated from one another, but if they were both using the same sources, then that's very possible. And in fact, where Matthew and Luke differ, we can see how they differed and why they differed and how that fit into their agenda as they were writing their version of Jesus' life. And so this other line is going to represent those Galilean followers and their remembrance of the sayings and the teachings and the actions of Jesus as he walked among them. It seems as we look at those sayings that those sayings were very much focused on the coming end of things. Those sayings were very much focused on how to prepare oneself for God's kingdom to finally come in fullness here on this earth. And those sayings don't seem to talk very much about Jesus' final week in Jerusalem. That wasn't a part of the experience of the people in the Galilee, and so it wasn't a part of what they remembered. There is a third group of followers, and this group is largely Gentile. And this group is almost completely located outside of the land of Palestine. This is the group that is reached by the missionary efforts of Paul and Barnabas, Silas, and others who went out to carry the message to all the world. This community grew at a rapid pace. The book of Acts gives us an idea of why that might have been. That Paul's strategy was to go from city to city, where large groups of people met, to find the Jewish community there that met in a synagogue, and to present himself as a teacher, because he had been educated by one of the great rabbis of the time, Gamaliel. And so Paul would teach in the synagogue, and he would teach not only the Jewish stuff, but he would teach about Jesus, the Christ, and what it meant that the Christ had come. Now, the audience that responded most to what Paul had to say were not always the Jewish people in each of those towns, but rather Gentile people. There was a significant number of Gentile people in that day and time who would come to the synagogue and who would sit in the back and listen to the teachings because the Greco-Roman world admired the ethics, the law, the orderliness of Jewish faith, respected the great antiquity of Jewish faith. Jewish faith extended far deeper in time than Roman faith did, and so they respected and admired that. These people were called God-fearers. And these God-fearers came and listened to what was going on in the synagogue and participated in synagogue life as much as they could, perhaps because joining meant circumcision. And in the Greco-Roman world, bathing was done in public and bathhouses. Perhaps for that reason, many God-fearers chose not to fully join Jewish communities, but to be God-fearers, to be people who feared the one true God, who tried as best they could to understand and keep the law and do the things that needed to be done. When Paul came to those people and said, you no longer have to try to become Jewish in order to be a part of God's people, but in fact now, because Jesus has come, and by his grace, you can be a part of God's kingdom, apart from the Jewish people and apart from circumcision, because baptism now is the same. That group responded immediately. Because that group was largely Greco-Roman, non-Jewish people, they brought with them a lot of practices and a lot of understandings from their broader world. They were an urban group as opposed to the rural group of the Galilee in northern Israel, and they were a secular group or a pagan group as opposed to the religious Jewish ones of Jerusalem. And so Paul brought them in and basically created this new faith that included everyone, including Gentiles, in the community created by God's covenant and God's promises. And their membership in that community was sealed by Jesus' grace and was made available to them through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. And the sign of that was the presence of the Spirit of God in their lives in the very same way that the Spirit of God was present in the lives of the Jewish followers of Jesus who had been there on the day of Pentecost. And so I'm going to draw that group down here, and I'm going to put a line on the board so that you can see them. Now, we have three distinctive followers of Jesus, and we have, for the Jerusalem group, obviously the Old Testament, the Torah, the Law and the Prophets, and the writings, the Psalms. There were lots of Psalms and prophets quoted in the Gospels, and so that tells us that those were important pieces of the Old Testament that were kept and taught and used by that community. In that Galilee group at the top in the north, what we have are the sayings, the Q document, and so those things are preserved. So what are the texts for this Gentile group? Well, they're the letters of Paul. All of the letters of Paul, all of the authentic letters of Paul, were composed before the first gospel was written down. So actually, if you want the clearest idea of what at least one of the early versions of Christianity taught and believed, read Romans. It was probably written almost 20 years before the first gospel was written down. And it was written by Paul maybe within 20 years of the death and resurrection of Jesus to a community of Christians, followers of Jesus, in Rome who were halfway across the Mediterranean from where the events of the life of Jesus had happened. And so he wrote that letter not to teach them, but to say, see, I believe what you believe. I want you to help me take this message further. So he didn't write with them to contend or to correct or to instruct. He wrote to say, now of course you know, this is what you believe and this is what I believe, and we share this same faith 20 years or so after the Jesus event, and 20 years or so before the first gospel was written down. Now we know from the book of Acts that Paul's version of the faith wasn't always approved by the Jerusalem elders, and we know from some of Paul's letters and writings that Paul didn't entirely approve of the Jerusalem guys. In fact, Galatians has a hot letter about his disagreements with those people. And so we have distinct groups that often don't agree with one another, that don't emphasize the same things, whereas the Galileans seem to emphasize the impending end of things and the need to prepare for this coming kingdom of God. It seems that the Jerusalem folks were saying, now that the Messiah has come, we can fully live out in the right way all that the law has required that we never understood before. And then you've got Paul saying, well, the Gentiles are a part of that too, because Jesus includes them, and they don't have to know anything about the law or any of that stuff, because all they need to know is that Jesus brings God's grace to them, and because of that, they're a part of God's family here in this world.